What social media apps are we currently using the most? We have some questions about fingerprinting and virtual machines and our recommendations for Android alternatives. We had a lot of questions this week. Welcome to the Q&A for Surveillance Report 218, where we are answering your questions from our amazing patrons who allow us to make this podcast for all of you. You can view and join the questions on patreon.com/surveillancepod or xmrchat.com/surveillancepod, where it's not recurring, but you don't have to give over any personal information. You just put in an email, display name, and send us a question.
No email.
Oh, no email. Never mind. You don't have to put in anything. Just send us some Monero, and you can put any display name you want and send us your thoughts. Our first question comes from Ethan, and we had a lot of questions this week, so we're going to try really hard to keep it brief. First up, which social media apps are you using most frequently right now? I'm pretty much only on Mastodon. I mean, technically I have like PeerTube because I self-host that. If you count things like Signal, then technically I'm really active on Signal because I text my wife all day long. But if you're talking traditional social media, I'm definitely a Mastodon guy. That's my personal thing.
Yeah, I mean, kind of same here. Yeah, I don't really like social media. I never liked the consumption aspect, and I don't generally like consumption of most platforms in general. And I really enjoy Mastodon. But even then, like, I post a lot to like Techlore socials, but I don't really like use most of them, if that makes sense. Like, I post to them, and then I have my personal Mastodon, and that's really the only major personal social media app that I ever use. Even then, I'd say, like, if you follow my personal Mastodon, you'll know I post there like maybe once every couple days on average. So pretty rare.
For the record, I really like the visual aspect of things like PixelFed. I think it's really cool. I just don't take a lot of pictures, so for me, it makes more sense to just go follow those accounts from Mastodon. I'm more of a text guy.
That's what's cool about the Fediverse. You can follow
I agree.
different mediums from the same place. It's cool. Ethan's next question is, are there any privacy-focused education apps you recommend? Replying to recent current DHS monitoring over 200 sites, including Duolingo. Yeah, I mean, you can try to avoid some of the obvious red flags. You know, if you found a list of things that you have concerns that you personally want to avoid, you can avoid things like Duolingo. I'm more in the boat that if you're following a lot of the advice that we give and you also set up your Duolingo account with alias information that's not directly tied to anything else, Duolingo doesn't require any kind of like direct PII, right? Like, you can set it up with a fake name, fake username, fake email, fake everything. As long as you do all those things and you take kind of the precautions that we discuss commonly on this podcast, I think that you're going to be fine, even using things like Duolingo. I use Duolingo for a long time, and I keep it in a web app when I can. And I have it set up with an alias email, and I kind of keep it as its own little like siloed account. So I think that's the best way to do it if you even use something like Duolingo. Otherwise, I don't have like a privacy first alternative to Duolingo, but I do have advice to make Duolingo more private.
I agree. I'm the same way. I do use Duolingo currently. And for the record, I know there's better ways to learn, but right now I'm very limited on money. I'm also very limited on time. I can't really commit to like paying or seeing the same tutor at the same time every week. And I know it's working because, you know, I live in Texas. I overhear Spanish conversations around me constantly, and every time I swear I understand more than I did last time. So yeah, you can put a privacy card on there. I'm using an alias email. I've put in like 2 X's for my name or something. I put in a zip code for downtown. You can use it in a PWA, like Henry was just saying. So,
and their web app is nice. It's like a good web app.
The FOSS community in general suffers from a problem of not being up to par. Like, we have a handful of things like email and browsers. Like, you know, Brave and Firefox are just as good as Chrome, arguably better in a lot of ways. Proton is just as good as Gmail. You know, we have things that can compete, but then when you start getting down to the niche things, like we talked about AI this week on the podcast, learning apps, Grammarly replacements, this, that, and the other, to-do lists. My wife has been looking for a to-do list since we got married to switch to something a little bit more private, and there's just not a lot of good options out there. So yeah, that's just kind of a FOSS problem in general. And I mean, there's people who make apps, but they're not very good looking. No offense to those people. I know you did a lot of work. You did better than I could, but they're not very polished. They don't have the same kind of funding and development that these mainstream apps do. So unfortunately, a lot of the time, you're just going to have to take an approach of harm reduction.
I think another way to word what you said, kind of like a running analogy or like a sports analogy, is like the team doesn't have much depth. The big players are really good, but beyond those first few players, like things kind of start dwindling a little bit more. It's something that's to work on. You know, I think that it's something we can all improve on. It's something we can be upfront about. And in the long run, I think we can get there. But that means we just have work to do.
I would take that as encouragement if I were you, because you could sit here and look at it. And like I said, I'm not trying to criticize. I don't know any code. I wish I did. I'm actually trying to learn code, and I would love to contribute once I know some code. But you could sit here and look at this as like, oh, Nate's complaining, everything sucks. Or if you know code, you could be like, hey, I know code. I can start working on a to-do list in my free time. I can start working on some kind of Duolingo front end or something in my free time. I mean, that one's kind of a tall order, a Duolingo replacement. But, if you know these things and you have the time or the resources, you could take that as an opportunity. Nobody else is doing it. You could be the first one and you could become the dominant name in that space. Next question, what crypto for private and instant transfers? Monero takes too long for when I need to send money IRL on the spot, instantly confirmed. Once again, I'm really not the crypto expert. And unfortunately, I'm going to go out on a limb and say there probably are none where you're going to get both of those things. With Bitcoin, you don't get either. So that's fun. And I'm sure all the crypto maxis will come in the comments and tell me that Bitcoin Cash version 2 Lightning / whatever fork probably has this, but whatever. There are obviously definitely some that are faster than others. Like I have made transactions with Monero, and you're right, it is a little slow. But for context, I've never made any transactions with Bitcoin because it was too damn slow and I just gave up and moved on with my day. So the only privacy coins that I know of are like Monero, Zcash. I've heard some people talk about Pirate Chain, but I don't know anything about it. I think there's a couple other ones. So this might be a situation where you have to pick one or the other. Either you get something really fast that doesn't have great privacy, or you take Monero and just accept the fact that you're going to hang out and talk with the person for 10, 15 minutes until the transaction goes through.
You don't need to wait for the full lock to be completed. Most Monero wallets should actually show you if there's an incoming transaction and it's waiting essentially to confirm. I think it's the block lock is what they call it. So, and it shows on your end too. I can speak to Cake Wallet at least. If I am receiving a Monero transaction, it'll literally show it like 1 out of 10 received. And then if I check it again 5 minutes later, it says like 6 out of 10 received. It will show you that it's being received. And typically, like most people aren't trying to scam you. And if you obviously trust the person. So I think I would still probably just encourage using Monero. It is a limitation to Monero that I hope people are able to figure out and make better in the long run. But it's going to be hard to find a service that does that. Gives you the privacy of Monero, but also makes it instant. That's asking a lot, I think, just based on the design of Monero and how kind of the privacy and security it offers. The next question is, what are the biggest usability barriers on Qubes OS, ignoring hardware compatibility issues? So I'm just going to rephrase that and say, let's assume you already got it installed, right? Like barring installation issues with Qubes OS, what are the usability issues from there? What changes would you want to see before you would recommend Qubes OS to any layman? I'm planning a Qubes OS review, so I'll definitely have better thoughts. So this is very preliminary. My initial thoughts is the fact that you have to read documentation to even know what you're doing. And I want to say that Qubes OS's documentation is fantastic. If you go on their site, you read through it, they do a great job of outlining how it works. And I think most people can kind of follow it and get behind it. But there's no good walkthrough, there are some fancy pieces of software that someone can download and it walks through how to use it. It gives them a walkthrough, tells them things you should do, things you shouldn't do. And then they kind of have at least a good starting point without needing to read formal documentation. And that's something that I think when I booted up Qubes for the first time was really interesting. I was like, well, I'm just kind of going. All right, let's see what happens. So that's the first thing for me, at least. The second thing is that I think the desktop environment is hideous. And I tried to install GNOME. I tried to install KDE. And if you've ever tried to do that on Qubes, it's actually a lot more complicated than it normally is because of the way that Qubes is designed. You have to try to get it installed on DOM0, but it has to apply to each virtual machine. And the way Qubes is designed, it's not as easy as it normally is to just flip-flop between different desktop environments. So in my journey of trying to set up different desktop environments on Qubes, it was actually really obnoxious. And I realized that it could actually create some instability. And more importantly, it's hard to actually make it unified. It's hard to have GNOME set up in a way where system menus, fonts, everything in every virtual machine is perfectly unified and not kind of mix and matched. So I think the DE and the lack of a walkthrough and a basic start guide are the two biggest things that personally I think are kind of holding it back right now.
I have been using Qubes for so long that I honestly don't remember what I struggled with, but I'm going to say it's probably the same things you mentioned. I will admit the UI is not great. I also remember that it was actually the first Linux distro I ever tried and immediately realized I have no idea what I'm doing. So I rolled back to Mint and tried a couple other distros. And eventually, once I understood Linux, I went back to Qubes. And there was still a bit of a learning curve, but at least then, that's why I always tell people, you have to have a basic understanding of Linux before you try to take on Qubes. Because there are a lot of things that are not designed with a GUI. So for example, my wife, I've been open about this, my wife uses Pop! OS on her laptop, And it just makes sense to her. She knows to open the software store. If there's anything really advanced, she'll ask me, but she knows how to update things. She knows how to, install software and how to use it. With Qubes, like they kind of leave it up to you. Like, okay, here are the VMs. And there's not really a desktop, to be fair, which I think is another point against it. I think customization is a little bit lacking, which I get why, but at the same time, like if we theoretically, and I don't even know if I necessarily care about this, but if we wanted the layman to use it, then that would definitely need to be a thing. But it's also, like Henry was saying, it's just not very intuitive. Like, it's intuitive now that I know what I'm doing, but as a first-time user, it was very like, I don't know where anything is. I don't know how to install software. I don't know how to update things. I don't understand, and again, this goes back to read the documentation, but I don't understand why the templates don't have internet access, so I can't, install new key rings to install new things. Yeah, I don't want to belabor the point. I think Henry hit the nail pretty good on the head. It's just not very intuitive.
Do you know what's better than great documentation?
Not needing documentation?
Exactly, and I think that's kind of the next step for Qubes. Like they've done a lot of great work, very respectable operating system. I really like what they're doing.
Especially on the budget.
Especially on the budget, especially with the team. But that's kind of the next step for them, I think, is like, how do you bring this to the wide public? Where they don't need to go online to your site to read the documentation to understand how it works. Like, how do you make that happen? And that's a really hard thing to do. So I don't want to discount, like when we're criticizing Qubes, it's not because we think it's easy to fix. It's because we want to see it get better and we kind of have a vision for what it could look like to make it easy and more accessible to people. But it's not taking away the good work they've done. They've done a lot of great stuff.
Next question, do you self-host an OIDC provider? And if so, which? I'm going to say I don't because I don't know what that is. Henry actually told me before we started recording. Apparently, it's kind of like an SSO single sign-on thing. It's a little bit interesting, but it also just doesn't seem like something I need in my life, to be honest. I don't see much of a use for it for myself personally. It's definitely useful in like corporate environments. I guess that's another reason I've never cared. If I had a team, maybe it would be worth it to me, but since I'm running solo, it's just whatever.
I mean, same here. I don't self-host this. I try to avoid SSO in general, but there are some situations where I do like it. If there's a website that I think I just don't get good vibes from and I don't trust them to like properly encrypt my credentials or keep things safe, I actually prefer sometimes using Google SSO for like this like spare Google account that I use mostly for that. But even then, I try to just not use it too much because everyone has heard the horror stories of people who like have all these accounts created on their Facebook or their Google account, and then they delete the account, they forget about all the other accounts, so I try not to rely on that too much. Second to last question from Ethan is, I've seen lots of news on behavior modification capitalism. Do you think the current news supply chain is inadequate? How can someone know which news source to trust? I want to start by saying we try to keep this Q&A as organic as possible, so we try to keep like research behind the scenes as minimal as possible so we can answer your questions as if you asked us in real time. I've never heard of this behavior modification capitalism before, but just going off of what you say in this question of, do you think the current news supply chain is inadequate? I'm unclear about this. I mean, like, I guess I can speak to personal experience. Sometimes I'll cover something that really is just news. It's just something that happened. Objectively, factually, all those things. And I can cover it and just cover the talking points of what happened. Sometimes, and I'm sure Nate's experienced this, in the comments you'll get 50% of people say, why didn't you bring this up? And 50% of people saying, why didn't you bring this other thing up? So where I'm going with this is two people who have their own views are interpreting me not talking about something as me being for what they're against, if that makes sense. I see that a lot where sometimes I'll watch something that seems very impartial, very just, that is what happened. And then I'll check comments on something and they'll say, well, this is biased news, this is not true news. And I guess I just struggle to follow that sometimes. Not that it doesn't happen and it isn't a problem, but those are kind of my thoughts. So I don't know exactly what this terminology is. As for whether the news supply chain is inadequate, I would say that there's probably too much money and it's probably centralized with too many individuals. But I don't know if that's exactly the problem that you're referring to. But I do think that there are too many people in the news world who have too many conflicts of interest that shouldn't exist. So I'd love to see more independent news sources that are reliable. That's not a bad thing to want.
So as usual, take it with a grain of salt, but according to Brave's AI summary, behavior modification capitalism is just another word for surveillance capitalism. Yeah, I'm not really sure how these things are related, to be honest. I think what I try to do is remain open to the possibility that I don't have all the facts. I try to find sources that seem to get it right most of the time and verifiably get it right, not just agree with me most of the time. But I think one way to check a news source is see what they say about something you know. So like if they say the anonymous cryptocurrency Bitcoin, I'm going to cut them a little bit of slack because everybody says that. But deep down, I'm also like, okay, so at very least that reporter does not necessarily know everything about this space. If you go check them on a subject where you're very much an expert and they keep screwing it up, maybe don't trust them with your news, because they're probably screwing up other things you're not an expert on. But if you go to the something that you are, and again, verifiable things, and they keep getting it right, then that's probably a good indicator that they can be trusted in other things. But I think also, we say this about our own show, but I think it applies to general news as well. Getting multiple sources. Like Reuters is kind of my main source just because they have that little 10-minute daily podcast and it gives me a good snapshot of what's going on in the world. But I mean, if people send me articles from other things, or if I see articles when I'm online, like I will definitely look at other sources and read other sources, especially if they're saying, no, calm down. That Reuters headline story was wrong today. Then I'm like, oh, tell me why. Why is it wrong? Why should I believe you? But I do agree with Henry. I think there are a lot of problems. And part of this is, I think there's a lot of factors that go into it, but I think there are some conflicts of interest with the mainstream news and their funding and who runs it. I also think that too many people are running to Substack and going, oh, this guy's the only person with this story, therefore he must be right. And maybe there's a reason he's the only person with that story. Just saying, like, obviously whistleblowers are a thing, but I think we could all benefit a little bit more from some critical thinking. The New Oil actually wrote a blog post about critical thinking, and it's literally how to evaluate a claim. Who's making the claim? What are their credentials? What is the claim itself? Does it conflict any known evidence? There are ways to evaluate this stuff that give you a pretty good read on whether or not it's trustworthy. I think the whole world needs a lot of that right now.
What I'd personally like to see, right now there's a lot of criticism towards news outlets, and it's been that way for probably the last 5 years now, maybe more. But I think people don't apply the same criteria that they're criticizing news for to individual creators and where they actually get their news from. And I think it's necessary, I feel like we've kind of developed a little community that really holds us accountable. We get something wrong and we get like a ton of comments about it. And it's something we like try to clear up. And like when we really screw up, we really try to make it right when we can. But that's not normal. I think like a lot of creators I see, make really big mistakes and they say things that are completely wrong and
they never issue a correction.
They never issue any kind of correction. They don't unlist it. And then people in the comments will just agree with it and say, wow, I didn't know this, as if it's fact. And that's not to say we haven't made, both of us have each made mistakes. But I think the reaction to those and like ways to correct them is definitely a little bit different.
Not to belabor this point too much, but I think it's important to differentiate news and analysis. If there's somebody you want to go to because you like their analysis and you like their perspective on things, that's fine. Just admit that they have a bias. There's a difference. All right, and then Ethan's last question. I don't have too much insight into this, but it says, I'm very excited for peer-to-peer applications. Have you seen anything cool on that topic? Are peer-to-peer applications more private than centralized? I worry about the added risk of being hacked due to being connected on a peer network using potentially vulnerable code. In regards to that last part, I think that's universal, whether it's centralized or whether it's peer-to-peer. Code can be crappy, whether it's peer-to-peer, whether it's centralized. It can be private or not, whether it's peer-to-peer, whether it's centralized. I don't think that really has any specific implication. I haven't seen anything particularly cool on the peer-to-peer front. I don't really pay attention to it, to be honest. But in general, I don't have anything against peer-to-peer. I think it's the same thing with everything else in privacy. It's got to be usable. It's got to have the features that are going to attract mainstream people. It's got to have the performance, all that kind of stuff. I don't have anything specific to call out that I'm looking forward to or whether or not I think it's going to catch on.
Yeah, I'd actually make the claim that generally speaking, P2P is actually less private. Generally, that doesn't include edge cases. So when you think of torrenting, for example, your IP address is like public in like a whole network and anyone can go in. And this is why you see those people online who get requests from their ISP, like they downloaded something illegal, they violated the terms and conditions, and it's because the ISP or whoever else is doing this kind of analysis can go in and see, all the peers who are connected and downloading a certain torrent file at a given time. That concern applies to everything else. So actually with Signal and Telegram, there was some research published not too long ago that exposed the fact that like your IP address is visible to your contacts. When you don't enable some of the privacy features inside of those messengers, that would prevent you from connecting to them P2P. I think in general, I don't mind saying that P2P actually has the potential of being less private. But then on the other hand, you have things like Briar that have like a Tor P2P implementation so that by default, like it does have action protection for each peer. And so there is a way to do it better, but I actually would be a little bit more cautious about P2P. But that is like the main thing I'd be watching out for any kind of P2P implementation, if anyone's kind of curious to look into that. I don't think hacking or vulnerable code, though, is dependent on whether or not something's P2P or centralized. That seems to be a pretty independent thing from what I can tell. David Johnson, one of our classics, a series, well, David Johnson's a classic, not the question. A series of interconnected questions about browser fingerprinting and VM. So the first one is, how much importance do you assign to combating advanced fingerprinting techniques that go beyond easy to thwart cookie type technology? I'll start by saying this is an extremely complicated area of discussion. It's still debated, even in the research and amongst experts, what the best way to deal with browser fingerprinting is. All I can tell you is that it is legitimately a problem, and my best analysis on the research I've seen so far is that a hybrid approach is the best way to deal with it, which is blocking scripts and trackers that block it by default and just prevent the fingerprinting from happening in the first place. But I also believe in going beyond that and also using browsers that implement browser fingerprinting techniques. So what comes to mind for me is the Tor browser is probably the best version of this, where they try to make users all look the same. And there might still be edge cases where, there might be a really unique way to fingerprint users. But if you're doing the blocking, you're also using something that has like browser fingerprinting built in. There's also Mullvad browser as well. And then to some extent, Brave even has some of this as well. Then you're getting kind of the best of all worlds. But I don't go beyond that, mainly because, and this is something I say pretty frequently, there is no evidence-based way to like deal with the problem completely. If I had a good answer for all of you that was easy, accessible, then I would totally recommend it. But there is no easy, usable, convenient way for all of you to just avoid fingerprinting techniques. What I just shared is kind of the best you can do as far as I'm aware and as far as it seems like most people are aware. We can hypothesize, we can put together theories, but they wouldn't be like backed by actual data and evidence that they work. I just don't feel comfortable going there with people, and it's not part of my risk tolerance to go there either. So I'm going to do what's most accessible and easiest to do, in addition to being evidence-based, so that I can guaranteed get benefits for what I'm doing. Those are kind of my loose thoughts. I assign importance to it by saying, do what you can. Use a browser that takes it seriously because it is important, but it shouldn't, make you like freak out when you're using the web. Like this is like very niche stuff, very advanced stuff, and you're probably no worse off than the average person if you're using any of these browsers. You're probably much better off.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. I think you should do what you can. I think and you'll talk about this in a later question, but like Byron Tao mentions that turning off app tracking on your iPhone does appear to actually be effective based on the experts that he spoke to and the people who work on the inside. So I think things like changing the settings on your devices, changing the settings in your apps, using fingerprint resisting technology. So, Tor, Brave, trying to make sure you don't overdo it, because I've seen those people who are like, I have Ghostery and uBlock and Disconnect and Brave and Privacy Badger and Cookie Auto Delete and this and that and the other. And it's like, cool, you stick out like a sore thumb because you have every freaking plugin known to man. Whereas, somebody who just has uBlock and Grammarly probably blends in a lot better. Not that I'm encouraging Grammarly, but I'm just saying. Just like Henry said, I think trying to do the best you can without overdoing it, because you definitely do hit a point of diminishing returns.
You should go the best that you can for your daily workflow, but there are dedicated tools that are designed for just this in mind. And that's where you get Hunix, that's where you get Tails OS. I think that's kind of the hidden thing that I guess we haven't been saying that we should say here, is that there are dedicated tools that you should be using if fingerprinting is actually like something you absolutely need to think about for a specific scenario. But we're just thinking of like day-to-day use, like is it something you should be concerned about? For most people, it's something to think about and just do what they can about, but there are dedicated tools for that.
And also on that note, it's a constant game of cat and mouse. So even let's say somebody says Brave. Brave is good enough for me. It has a lot of great out-of-the-box privacy features that don't impede my workflow. And you could say, well, yeah, what about this fingerprinting technique? Valid. But as time goes on and that gets more common, Brave is going to come up with a way to counter that. And, whoever else, for the record, I'm not trying to sing Brave's praises specifically, but the privacy community is going to find a way to counter that. And then the companies, when that starts to spread on, the companies are going to find a way to work around that. I mean, just look at the whole YouTube ad blocking thing. I don't mean that in a defeatist way where it's like, well, it doesn't really matter. But at the same time, it's not worth ruining your job and your relationships and running yourself ragged David goes on to say next, it is claimed that a lot of such techniques are not virtual machine resistant. In other words, the fingerprint will not persist across the same virtual machine configuration on different VMs. Do you do anything to compartmentalize your same browsing activity into different VMs for this reason? Technically, I do, just through the use of Qubes. I have one Qube that's dedicated for the new oil, one that's dedicated for important stuff like banking and medical, one that's dedicated for personal stuff. On Windows, not so much, but also on Windows, I primarily use this as like video editing, gaming, stuff that's not really that sensitive. But I still do things on Windows. Like I have Portmaster, I use a VPN. Again, I've changed a bunch of the settings. I've disabled a bunch of stuff with some of the more trustworthy Windows scripts out there. So I technically do, but I think virtual machines in general are a much more advanced thing. I think they're great if they know what you're doing, but I think asking the average person to use them is a little bit too much.
Don't really disagree. And kind of speaking to my last point, I made this analogy with a friend recently because they saw some of the fingerprinting discussions on our forum on Techlore recently, where the Kaji CEO went in and, kind of justified their reasoning for not including fingerprinting resistance. I disagreed and gave my reasons for why fingerprinting resistance is important. It's a whole thing. If you want to dig into both of our reasonings, my takeaway from it is it's a lot like microplastics in a sense of microplastics are this thing where we know is a problem. It's everywhere. We know it's everywhere. We have research showing it's everywhere, but we also just don't fully understand how to deal with it yet. And we don't even know the real impacts of it yet. We know that it's probably used pretty often and a lot of people do manipulate it, but we don't know to what extent. We don't know how to fully deal with it yet. It's very early on. It's one of those things that I think should be kind of seen as microplastics, which is do what you can realistically, but it's a problem that everyone is equally dealing with. It is not something that's individualized, and there are dedicated tools, again, that you should be using if you really care about this stuff, which is like Unix, Tails OS, any of these kind of tools that you can utilize to help kind of get away from the fingerprinting concerns in the first place. There's this weird overlap here of effort to success, and I can never actually tell you that what you're going to do is going to guarantee success because we just don't have the information to make it completely foolproof. That's the best advice I can give. Anything else is kind of speculating how successful it is. Okay, the next one, I'm actually gonna carry it to you because this is your book.
Oh, okay. So the book I recommended by Byron Tao, which is called Means of Control for those who are joining us, goes into quite a bit of detail into large-scale harvesting and resale of phone location data and also some degree of DNS data by surveillance capitalism companies. How likely do you think it is that the same thing is going on with browser fingerprinting data but has not been brought to light? Absolutely. There's not a freaking doubt in my mind. Like you said, we don't really have a lot of evidence, and Henry just said that too. That's the problem with browser fingerprinting. And for the record, I am so slow to put out videos, and I'm sorry, it came out all the way in November, but my latest video is all about browser fingerprinting, and I quoted as much as I could, which you still have to take it with a grain of salt, because these are companies who are marketing their browser fingerprinting to other companies. So of course they're going to BS, and they're going to be like, yeah, man, we can track an ant crawling on a tombstone in China, we're so advanced. So they could be lying, but that was a Three Body reference, by the way. So they're saying that they can do everything, but at the same time, we know that these companies sometimes lie. So it's kind of hard to tell. You have to take it with a grain of salt. But at the same time, they're very open about it. They're like, no, we can track anybody. We use browser fingerprint. We can track hundreds of different data points. And I've heard this repeated everywhere. And granted, this could be a case of I forget what it's called, but that logical fallacy where everybody just repeats the same thing. I definitely do think it's happening, and I think it's probably a really big problem, and that's why I'm glad that there are people like Tor and Brave that are trying to do something about this, but I guess that's the answer to your question. I definitely think it's happening for sure.
The last question here is of the three main Linux-compatible local VM options, VirtualBox, VMware, and KVM, what do you prefer, and what do you think the main differences and pros and cons are? I liked KVM just because I felt like it was the best performance, and it was simple enough for me to use. Yeah, I didn't overthink it. I tried the main options, and I thought KVM was just the most usable. Virtual machines, I don't think we really have the luxury of picking between, 5 fantastic options and saying, oh, this has this one feature I really enjoy. Virtual machine software, I think, is still in a lot of ways kind of most of them are it works good enough and it boots and it isn't terribly slow. And then sometimes one just does quite a bit better, and that was KVM for me.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't have a lot of experience. The only two I've actually messed with are VirtualBox and VMware, and I prefer VirtualBox just because I found it a little bit more user-friendly. That's really the only reason. And then real quick, there was a second part to the question. You said that some people also mentioned Tails, but it seems the main use for that would be someone worried about having their machine seized and forensically examined. Do you think there are other less extreme reasons to use it? I'm telling you right now, if I was and put your politics aside right now because I don't care. If I was, for example, a gay kid in a very conservative household who maybe wanted more information about human sexuality and I was tech savvy enough, I'd be using the hell out of Tails just because I would be really worried about my parents putting me on the street. And for the conservatives listening, maybe you're not that much of a monster, but I've definitely met people who are. So that is a real concern. Like if I was in a really extreme situation, even if it wasn't about forensics, if it's just, I forgot to delete my browser history, anything like that, where it's like, no, it's really, really important that I do not get caught. That's what I would be using Tails for. If I was in a situation where I just didn't want it, whether it was forensic or not, I just didn't want to make any mistakes, I would use Tails. I don't know if you want to add on to that or not.
No, I'm good.
And then our last question comes from Gregory Zingler. I need help getting a good recommendation for Android alternative. I've looked at EOS, I've looked at Lineage, I've looked at Graphene. I would like a good default messenger app for SMS, MMS, and RCS because my family won't move to Signal, and other solid default apps. Skill level aside, I am hoping to pick one that is easy to use, private, secure, and open source. So there's a lot of things here. You mentioned a bunch of different apps. So the main concern would be device compatibility because, okay, let's say you have infinite money, then obviously go get a Pixel and go put one of those on it. If you already have a device and you don't want to get a new one for whatever reason and say it's not a Pixel, then you're going to be limited by what you have. Personally, I kind of lean towards Lineage at that point because everything else is basically just a fork of Lineage. If you have a Fairphone, you can get Calyx, which I would recommend over Lineage because you can lock the bootloader. I think if you have a Pixel, Graphene really is the best choice. It's got very strong security. They proxy a lot of stuff through them before sending it to Google. So you have a really good layer of privacy. But again, there are plenty of reasons to use something else. Like if you don't have a Pixel, then you might consider Calyx or Lineage. I mean, as far as default stuff, I don't really use a lot of the default stuff because first of all, I don't use like the music player, the gallery. I usually replace everything anyways with like MySudo or Signal or, whatever other apps. I don't know. I think device is mainly your limitation here. I think based on whatever device you have, you should go for the most secure and close to the source option possible. And I'm talking about Lineage when I say that second part.
I think I overall pretty much agree. And I think it really sucks that Divest is no longer a thing because Divest was previously like a more secure version of Lineage. Some devices had even brought verified boot too, which is really cool. So that was really nice.
To be fair, I think it would have had some compatibility issues or some usability issues since it didn't support either Google or MicroG in a privileged manner. So unless you're like really hardcore de-Googled, and that could have been an issue. But anyways.
And that speaks to kind of my point, which is like all of these different, ROMs, they just prioritize different things. Like, so see what they do, see what you need, and pick accordingly. There's a lot of us versus them, I think, in the ROM space. And I think they can all exist. Just pick the one that works well for you based on device compatibility, based on what features they provide, based on the pricing security they provide, and based on what you need. And I think that's overall going to be like pretty timeless advice, regardless of what new ROMs exist in 5 years or where the current ones still stand.
Well said. Just real quick, we didn't get any questions on XMR chat, but we did get Tomatoes said love the podcast and tipped us quite a bit of Monero. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you. And everybody else, we really appreciate you guys. Every single one of you that keep this going. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you again for asking questions. And if you are not already on Patreon, you can join the Q&As by joining patreon.com/surveillancepod. We also have a Signal group that's very healthy. We have a SimpleX group as well. So if you don't like Signal, but you like SimpleX, we have a sister community spinning up there that is only available to patrons. So far, it's doing pretty well. So you can join us there, or, we also have for $10 a month or more on Patreon, you can go ahead and get the extended version of the podcast, which this week was like twice as long. It was crazy. And then, of course, we also have other things like, just regular Monero and LibrePay. But obviously, if you want to join the Q&A, Patreon and XMR chat are going to be your best option. So either way, thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for supporting us. We really appreciate you. And we will see you this weekend with another episode of Surveillance Report.